Alright. This is the one they swore was never coming. Because look at where Drake is standing tonight, and understand that this is not a flop, this is not a chart slip, this is not another buried subliminal that nobody is going to replay next week, and this is not even the Kendrick Lamar war we have all been arguing about for 2 years straight. What is landing right now is bigger than every single one of those things put together, because the audience that actually built Drake, the audience that carried him out of blog posts and into stadiums, the audience that turned his voice into the soundtrack of every pre-game, every car ride, every night out for an entire generation of women, and specifically black women, is now sitting in front of cameras, on the record, with their names attached, saying out loud that they are done. Not annoyed. Not taking a break. Done. And once you understand what that room of people built for him, you are going to understand why this is the most dangerous headline of his entire career, and why none of the numbers he keeps waving in our faces can do a single thing about it. And before we go 1 inch further into this, hit that like button, because we are about to walk through the one part of this story that his people have spent 2 years hoping nobody would say into a microphone. It moves the needle more than you know, and it takes you 2 seconds. 1 tap is a receipt. 2 taps and a comment, and you just made this thing impossible to ignore. So here is exactly what you are getting in the next few minutes, because I am not going to make you wait around for it. I am going to show you the precise era where the split happened, and I mean the specific records, the specific creative choices, the specific audience he traded away and what he thought he was getting in return. I am going to show you why the women who defended him the longest are the ones speaking the coldest right now. And I am going to show you the one clip from this new era that turned a slow drift into a public break, because that clip did something no diss track ever managed to do to him. It made the people who loved him first look at him and feel embarrassed. See, that is the part that his defenders cannot argue their way out of, and that is the part one want you to sit with before we get into any of the receipts. You can survive bad reviews. Artists survive bad reviews every year. You can survive a rival out-rapping you, because rap has been handing out losses since the day it started and plenty of legends took one and kept eating. What you do not survive is the moment your original audience stops being angry at you and starts being embarrassed for you. Anger means they still care about the outcome. Embarrassment means they have already left the building and they are just describing what they saw on the way out. And that is exactly the temperature of what is being said about Drake right now. Because these are not rivals talking. These are not people who ever needed him to fail. Go listen to the women speaking about Drake and you will notice something that should terrify everybody on his payroll, which is that almost every single one of them opens by telling you they used to be a fan. They tell you which albums they wore out. They tell you which songs got them ready before they walked out the door. They are not coming in as haters, they are coming in as former believers, and a former believer is the most credible witness that exists in music, because nobody can accuse them of never having given him a chance. They gave him a decade. Some of them gave him more. One of them said she has not put a full Drake project in real rotation since Scorpion, and I want you to actually hear what that means instead of scrolling past it. That is not a critique of a single record. That is a woman telling you the last time an entire body of his work earned a permanent place in her life, and everything after that has been one Drake song she plays once, maybe twice, and never returns to. She used the word timeless, and she was not using it as a compliment to him. She was using it as a measuring stick, and she was telling you he stopped clearing it. Another one said something even sharper, and honestly it is the line that has been echoing around this whole conversation. She said that when you sign up to be an artist, you sign up to do the inner work, because without the inner work the art stops moving. And then she looked straight down the barrel of the camera and said that is precisely what happened here, that the growth just stopped, and that watching it happen to somebody she used to defend is uncomfortable to sit through. Now be honest with yourself for 1 second. When has a criticism of Drake ever come from that angle? For years the attacks were about authenticity, about ghostwriters, about who was really holding the pen, about whether he was hard enough or from where he claimed. Those are all arguments a rich man can hire his way out of, and he did, over and over, for a decade. But this is a completely different species of problem, because the women in this conversation are not questioning his credentials. They are telling you he stopped developing as a person, and that his music is simply reporting the outcome. You cannot buy your way out of that. You cannot sue your way out of that. There is no legal team on this planet that can file paperwork against a woman saying she outgrew you. And that thread deserves its own night, because there is a lot more where that came from, but right now I need to take you back to the beginning, and I need to do it properly. Because to understand how catastrophic this break actually is, you have to remember what Drake was to these women in the first place, and I do not think the current generation of his defenders has any real idea. Because rewind it. Go all the way back to the stretch where nobody was arguing about any of this, when the mixtapes were still passing hand to hand and the radio had not fully committed yet, and understand what Drake actually was in the culture at that moment. He was not the tough guy. He was not the boss in the corner of the room with the sunglasses on indoors. He was the singing one. He was the one who admitted things out loud that the rest of the genre would not admit at gunpoint. He was the guy who would rap for 90 seconds and then start crooning like nobody was watching, and the reason that worked, the entire reason it worked, is because there was a specific audience sitting there waiting for somebody to do exactly that. That audience was women. And at the center of that audience, holding it up, were black women. And I need to be very precise about this, because his current defenders like to flatten it into nothing. This was not a soft demographic that happened to like a few singles. This was the engine. This was the group that decided, collectively, that Drake was going to be the sound of the part of the night that nobody films. Understand the structure of that, because it is genuinely the most valuable real estate in popular music and almost nobody ever gets handed the keys to it. Drake was on while the makeup was going on. Drake was in the group chat when the plans were being made. Drake was in the car on the way, then it followed everybody through the door of the club, and by the time the night was ending it was the thing everybody was screaming word for word with their arms around each other. He owned the beginning of the night, the middle of the night, and the walk home. That is not fandom. That is infrastructure. And here is the piece that his people conveniently forget when they start bragging about Drake's catalog numbers. When women commit to an artist at that level, the men arrive automatically. They always do. They arrive because that is what is playing where the women are, and they stay because they figure out it is a smart place to be. So every stadium Drake ever filled, every festival headline slot, every year at the top of the charts, all of it was built on a foundation that a specific group of listeners poured for him for free, and they did it because he was the one guy in the genre willing to say the awkward thing on record instead of pretending he was made of concrete. So sit with the size of what is happening now. The people who poured that foundation are on camera describing him like a project they used to work on. Because there is a second layer to this that makes it even worse for him, and this is the part one really want you to hold on to, because it explains everything that comes later in this story. Back then, the corniness worked. It genuinely did. He would say something so soft that your whole group would laugh at him, and it landed anyway, because it was clearly coming from him. It was his actual personality leaking through the speakers. Nobody was accusing him of running a focus group on it. One of the women speaking on this said it better than any critic has managed to, and her point was that back then the corniness was just him being himself, so it was harmless. It was even endearing. And now the same behavior reads completely differently, because now it is a man performing a character he is not, and there is no version of that which is ever cute. That is the whole story in 2 sentences, and we are only getting started. See, this is where I have to bring in the thing that everybody in this conversation keeps circling, and it is the single most useful sentence anybody has said about this entire era. Money does not change people. Money exposes people. That is the mechanism. That is the whole engine of this collapse, and once you install that idea in your head, the last several years of Drake's career stop looking random and start looking inevitable. Because in the early stretch, before the fortune got generational, he was operating with something to prove, and the thing he was proving was that a rapper could be openly, embarrassingly human and still fill an arena. There was no cushion. There was no army of yes men. There was an audience he had to earn every single week, and that audience had taste, and it had standards, and it would tell him immediately when something was not working. That pressure is what made the early work good. Constraint made him honest, and honesty made him enormous. Then the constraint disappeared. Then the money stopped being money and became a weather system. And the man who emerged out the other side of that was not a bigger version of the artist those women signed up for. It was a completely different guy wearing the same name, and the terrifying part, the part that should keep his whole camp awake, is that the audience who knew him best noticed the swap first, and they noticed it years before the rest of the internet caught up. So now let me show you exactly where the wheels came off, because there is a specific window, and you can hear it happening in real time if you know what you are listening for. Because the drift did not arrive as an announcement. That is the thing nobody prepares you for. There was no press release, no reinvention interview, no dramatic pivot record where he stood up and told everybody he was becoming somebody else. It came in slowly, one album cycle at a time, and the first people who felt it were the exact people who had the Drake catalog memorized. Listen to the women describing this and you will notice they all land on the same window. Around the stretch of the long, bloated, mood board Drake projects, the one stacked with more songs than anybody asked for, the writing started to change temperature. The subject matter narrowed. And what it narrowed down to was a grievance. Suddenly the recurring character on record was not a woman he loved, it was a woman who supposedly wronged him, and every project after that seemed to circle back to her, or to some composite of her, with the same tone every time. She owed him. She misread him. She should have known better. She should apologize. And I want to be extremely fair here, because I am not interested in pretending Drake never made a good song again. He absolutely did. There are records from that stretch that still move a room and everybody knows it. But the women in this conversation are not talking about individual songs. They are talking about a posture, and a posture is what an audience actually lives inside when they put an album on. One of them said it plainly, that around a certain point she could no longer get through a full project without feeling physically unsettled, and that the reason was simple. If women are supposed to be your core audience, why does your catalog keep talking about us like this? Say that question out loud a few times, because nobody in his camp has ever answered it. And this is where the whole thing tips from artistic criticism into something a lot harder to walk back. Because it stopped being confined to nameless composites on album tracks. The perception took hold, and it took hold for years, that when he had a grievance with a woman who was widely known and widely loved, it found its way into a bar. Whether every single one of those reads was fair is genuinely debatable, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But perception is the only currency that matters in a relationship with an audience, and the perception that settled in was that the women getting brushed in his lyrics kept turning out to be black women who the culture was actively protecting. You cannot survive that. Not with that audience. Not with that specific audience, who had spent a decade being the loudest room in the building for him. Because understand the deal that was quietly in place. The arrangement was never that he had to be perfect. The arrangement was that he was the one who understood. He was the artist who was supposed to be on their side of the argument. That was the entire brand. That was why the vulnerability sold in the first place. So the second the vulnerability turned into a running scoreboard of everything women had allegedly cost him, the deal was void, and the deal being void is not something you can fix with a feature or a summer single. And here is the part that makes it genuinely strange as a business decision, which one of the women pointed out and which nobody in his organization seems to have ever considered. It does not even make commercial sense. If you are selling pop-facing rap, if your entire machine is built to be consumed at maximum scale, why would you spend album after album alienating the demographic that decides what gets played in every room where music is chosen socially? That is not artistic risk. That is not edge. That is a man dismantling his own distribution network in slow motion because his feelings got loud. Now stay with me, because this is where it gets significantly worse, and this is the part of the timeline that the current defenders of Drake cannot spin no matter how hard they try. Because while he was busy pushing away the audience that built him, he was simultaneously chasing a completely different one. And that is the decision that turned Adrift into a betrayal. Because he did not just wander away from the women who made him. He went looking for the approval of the exact crowd that had been mocking him the entire time he was busy becoming the biggest artist alive. And that is the pivot that this whole story turns on, so let me lay it out the way the women in this conversation laid it out, because they were blunt about it in a way most critics are too polite to be. Drake started making music for men. That is it. That is the fracture. He took the most successful formula in modern popular music, a formula he personally invented and personally monopolized, and he abandoned it in order to go collect a cosign from a room that was never going to fully accept him. The sound got harder. The features got harder. The posture got harder. Suddenly the same guy who built an empire out of admitting he was in his feelings was standing in the middle of the frame acting like he had never had a feeling in his life. And the audience he built that empire on watched the transformation happen and said the only thing there is to say about it, which is that none of it was him. One of the women summed the entire era up in a single sentence, and it is brutal, because she said he ended up making music for losers. And before anybody clutches their chest about that, understand exactly what she meant, because she was not insulting the listener for having ears. She was describing a target demographic. She was saying that the version of the audience he went chasing is a crowd that consumes music as a status accessory rather than as something you actually live with, and that the moment you start making records for people who treat art like a scoreboard, your records stop having a reason to exist after the first week. And you can see the outcome of that in the most measurable way possible. Zero replay value. Records that arrive enormous and evaporate. Then she said the part that ties the whole thing together. She said it should be studied. Not mocked. Studied. Because when an artist voluntarily walks away from the most loyal audience in the industry to go audition for people who were laughing at him, that is not a career mistake. That is a psychological event, and it deserves a case file. And Drake has never once, in any interview, in any verse, in any late-night stream, acknowledged that the trade even happened. Now I want to be very specific about why this trade was so catastrophic, because it goes deeper than the sound of the records. When you build your career on being the sensitive one, and then you spend years performing hardness, you do not just lose the people who like the sensitivity. You lose the credibility of everything you already made. You retroactively poison your own catalog, because now every honest song in the back catalog reads like it might have been a marketing position all along. That is the real damage. He did not just change lanes. He made his own audience go back and question whether the original version was ever real. And be honest, because you have watched this play out in real time on your own timeline. Everything about the tough guy chapter has landed with the specific sound of a man trying to convince himself. The wardrobe of it. The scowl of it. The company he keeps in the frame. Drake comparing himself to figures he has nothing in common with. There was a moment where he put himself next to old-world gangster mythology as if that was a natural fit for the Drake who once sang about his eyebrows being too thick on stage, and one of the women in this conversation actually stopped and pleaded with him not to do it again, which is genuinely the most humiliating form of criticism there is, because pleading is what you do with somebody you have given up on impressing. And that brings me to the second habit, which is the one I think historians are actually going to focus on. The insertion habit. The pattern of arriving wherever momentum already exists and standing next to it until some of it transfers. A sound breaks out of a city, and here comes Drizzy. A young artist develops a distinctive cadence, and within a cycle that cadence is on a record with a bigger budget. Every scene that started to move on its own eventually got a visit. And to be completely fair, that is not illegal and it is not even unusual in music. Plenty of enormous artists have done exactly this. But the women in this conversation are making a different point, and it is a sharper one. Their point is that when you look back over the whole run and see how many times that maneuver got repeated, you stop reading it as collaboration and start reading it as a business model. And a business model is not an artistic identity. It is a strategy for never having to build anything from scratch again. So put those two things side by side, because together they explain everything. A man performing a character that is not his, while borrowing charisma from people who are doing the real work. That is the Drake who came out of the money. And then Kendrick Lamar showed up and said all of it out loud in front of the whole world, and that is where this stopped being a conversation about music. Because everything I have just walked you through was already true before Kendrick Lamar ever said a word. That is what I need you to understand. The drift was already in motion, the women had already started stepping back quietly, and the resentment writing was already stacking up on record. What the war with Kendrick Lamar did was not create the problem. What Kendrick Lamar did was turn the lights on in a room that had been getting darker for years. And that is why the women in this conversation keep returning to Kendrick, because for them that war was not entertainment. It was confirmation. One of them put it in the most direct terms possible. She said the Kendrick battle pulled the curtain all the way back, and that when it was over he had proven himself to be precisely the person Kendrick Lamar had accused him of being. Think about how devastating that framing is. She is not saying Drake lost a rap battle to Kendrick. Losing a rap battle is survivable and rap has proven it 100 times. She is saying the Kendrick accusations functioned as a diagnosis, and the diagnosis was correct, and everything Drake has done since has kept confirming it. Because look at what actually happened after the smoke cleared. There was a stretch of silence after Kendrick. Then there was a return. And the return did not contain a single ounce of the one thing that could have saved him with this audience, which was reflection. Not an apology, nobody in rap is asking for an apology. Reflection. One human sentence acknowledging that being publicly dismantled by Kendrick Lamar hurt, and that he had heard the criticism, and that he was going to go somewhere new with it. Instead, the world got the opposite. The world got a Drake who came back and doubled down on every single trait that got him diagnosed in the first place. And one of the women said the thing about this that I have not been able to shake, because she framed it as a physical fight. She said if the Kendrick exchange had happened in a ring, he would not have been on his feet at the end of it. He would have been on the floor, and the people in his corner would have been checking whether he needed a hospital. And her point in saying it that way was not to be cruel. Her point was that the aftermath is where the humiliation actually lives. Because you can be knocked down in a fight and keep every ounce of your dignity, that happens all the time, that is sport. What you cannot do is get up off the canvas, refuse to acknowledge that you ever went down, and then spend the next 2 years throwing jabs at the man who put you there while insisting the fight never happened. That is not toughness. Everybody watching can see exactly what that is. And then she landed on the detail that makes the whole thing unbearable, which is that he walked into that war unprepared against a Kendrick Lamar who has a Pulitzer sitting on a shelf. He picked a contest of language against Kendrick Lamar, whose entire life is language, and he picked it with his whole chest, in public, at the peak of his commercial power. Now here is where I have to be straight with you, because I refuse to run the kind of one-sided argument that gets made about this every single day by people who are not honest. The Drake machine still works. It objectively does. The new material moves numbers that most of the genre would trade a limb for, and anybody telling you otherwise is lying to your face for engagement. The streams come in. The chart positions arrive. The tour buses still fill up. On paper the operation looks perfectly healthy, and that is exactly why his defenders sleep so well at night. But put that on the table for a second and look at what it is actually measuring. Numbers measure arrival. They do not measure attachment. Numbers tell you how many people opened the door on day 1. They tell you absolutely nothing about how many of them are still in the room in month 6, and that gap is the entire story of this era. Because you can be the biggest selling artist in your class and simultaneously be the artist nobody is quoting, nobody is playing at a function unprompted, and nobody is going back to a year later. That is precisely what these women are describing. They are not describing an artist who stopped selling. They are describing an artist who stopped mattering to them, and those are two completely different diseases, and only one of them shows up on a chart. And the moment his own listeners started saying it out loud in public is the moment the numbers stopped being a shield and started being a costume. Because here is the question I want you to hold on to for the rest of this, and I want you to answer it in the comments, because I genuinely cannot decide where I land on it. If the biggest audience in the world is showing up out of habit rather than out of love, is that a career, or is that just momentum that has not finished dying yet? Because the women in this story have already answered that question. And history has a very ugly track record of eventually agreeing with the women who left first. Because now we arrive at the moment that turned all of this from a slow bleed into a public break, and I need you to understand why one piece of footage did more damage with this audience than 2 years of diss records ever managed. It was the glove. A cultural relic, a piece of stageware that belongs to the single most important performer this industry has ever produced, and there was Drake, handling it, wearing it, stretching it out to fit a hand it was never built for. And that image, that one small physical image, said everything the women in this conversation had been trying to explain for years, in less time than it takes to blink. Because that is the pattern in miniature. Take something that already carries meaning, put it on, and hope the meaning transfers. It never does. Meaning does not transfer. Meaning has to be earned, and the only thing you accomplish by forcing yourself into something sacred is that everybody gets to watch it not fit. And this is exactly where that idea comes back with full force. Money does not change people. Money exposes them. Because a man with less money does not get access to the relic. A man with less money does not get to test whether reverence is something you can purchase. The money did not make him do it. The money simply removed every obstacle between him and who he already was, and what was underneath was a man who thought greatness was a costume with an availability date. And Drake did it after the war. That is the part that keeps this from being a small story. Not before. After. After Kendrick Lamar publicly accused him of watering the culture down for profit, after being called a tourist in a house he did not build, after 2 full years to sit with everything Kendrick said and consider whether any of it had landed. And the very first major statement of his comeback era was to reach for somebody else's artifact and squeeze himself into it. Look, the argument Kendrick Lamar was making was never actually complicated. Strip away the theater and the Kendrick accusation was this, that you can extract from a culture at scale while contributing nothing back to it, and that the extraction gets easier the more powerful you become. That is the Kendrick charge. And in one clip, with a stretched glove and a satisfied expression, Drake went out and dramatized the charge himself, for free, in front of everybody. So now the picture is complete, and I want to lay it out end to end, because when you see the sequence in one place it is genuinely hard to believe it belongs to one career. Drake arrived as the artist who told the truth about himself when nobody else in the genre would. He was adopted by an audience of women, and specifically by black women, who turned him into the sound of their most personal hours. He converted that loyalty into the biggest commercial run modern rap has ever seen. Then he took the resulting money and used it to buy the freedom to stop being the person they signed up for. He started writing grievance instead of feeling. He aimed that grievance, over and over, in the direction of the audience that built him. He went shopping for a tougher crowd who never wanted him. He lost the most consequential lyrical war of his lifetime to a Kendrick Lamar who told the public exactly what he was. He came back without 1 ounce of self-examination. And then he put on a dead genius's glove and grinned about it. That is not a fall from grace. A fall implies gravity did it. This was constructed. Decision by decision, cycle by cycle, with a full staff of people who were presumably being paid to say something. Now here is where I have to hand it to the women in this conversation, because they identified the real cost before anybody else did, and it has nothing to do with sales. The cost is that the intimacy is gone, and intimacy is the only thing that was ever actually his. Anybody can buy volume. Any label with a marketing budget can manufacture a debut week. What he had was rarer than volume and it was completely unpurchasable. He had permission to be in the room while women were getting ready. He had permission to be the voice in the car on the way. He had permission to be the record playing while somebody cried over somebody who did not deserve it. That is the deepest access an artist can be granted in a person's life, and it is granted by trust, and trust is the one asset on the Drake balance sheet that his money could never protect. He spent it. All of it. On a costume. And you want to know what the loneliest detail in this entire story is? The audience he traded them for was never loyal to him in the first place. That crowd does not do loyalty. That crowd rides whatever is winning this quarter and disappears the second the temperature drops, and everybody in the industry knows it. So he broke a decade-long bond with the most durable listeners in music in order to rent approval from a room that checks the standings before it decides how it feels about you. That is the trade. And that is why the women speaking now sound less like critics and more like people reading a verdict. So let me bring this all the way back around to where we opened, because I told you at the start that this headline was more dangerous than any chart story, and now you can see exactly why. Kendrick did not end Drake. Understand that, because it is the part everybody gets wrong. Kendrick Lamar did not finish Drake. What Kendrick Lamar did was hold up a mirror at the worst possible angle and refuse to lower it, and the reflection was accurate enough that it could never be argued with. But a mirror is not a weapon. A mirror is a diagnosis. The actual ending, if this turns out to be one, is not being written by Kendrick Lamar at all. It is being written by the women who used to defend him in group chats, one calm sentence at a time, on camera, with no beat behind it and no aggression in their voice. Because that is the sound of a career-changing state. Not booing. Not backlash. Not a viral pile-on that burns out in a weekend. A former believer, sitting down, explaining without any anger left in her voice why she stopped going back to the albums. You do not come back from that with a feature. You do not come back from that with a new alias, a new chain, a new city to plant your flag in, or a harder guest verse. And you definitely do not come back from that by pretending it never happened, which is the only strategy this camp has run since the day the mirror went up. Because here is the actual, terrifying arithmetic underneath all of it, and I want to leave you holding this. The men that this whole reinvention was designed to impress were never the customers. They were always the followers. They came because the women came, they always come because the women come, and that is the oldest rule in popular music. So when the women step off, the countdown starts, and it does not start on the charts. It starts in the rooms where nobody is measuring anything, where somebody scrolls past a song and does not think twice about it, and then one day the machine turns around and discovers there is nothing underneath it but marketing. Now, could Drake fix it? Genuinely, I want to know what you think, because this is the one thread I cannot close on my own. Because in theory the fix is not complicated at all. One record. No features, no war, no scoreboard, no borrowed relics, nobody's flow in his mouth. Just the guy who used to say the awkward thing out loud, sitting down and admitting that he got lost inside the money and inside the loss and inside 2 years of pretending neither one touched him. Every single woman in this conversation would listen to that record. Every one of them. They told you so themselves, because every last one of them opened by saying they used to be a fan, and nobody says that about somebody they have finished caring about. But does Drizzy have it in him? Because doing that requires the one currency he has never spent in public, and that is honesty about himself at his own expense. And so far, every single time Drake has been handed the chance to be human in front of us, he has reached for the costume instead. So tell me where you land, and I mean actually tell me, because I want to read all of it. Do you think Drake lost the women, or do you think he traded them on purpose and thought the numbers would cover the difference? Do you think the war was the cause of this collapse, or do you agree with the women who are saying it only exposed something that was already rotting? And be honest with this last one, because it is the one that is going to start a fight in the comments and I want the fight. Was he ever really the artist they believed he was, or was that the most successful marketing position in the history of rap music? Correct me in the comments if you think I have misread any part of this, because I read every single one of them and I want the ones that disagree with me most. And if you are still riding with me this deep into it, do me one favor and leave that like, because this is exactly the conversation his people spend all day trying to bury under noise, and it moves the needle more than you know. Subscribe while you are down there, because this story is nowhere near finished, and the next chapter of it is going to be uglier than this one. Because there is one more piece to all of this that I did not get into tonight, and it is the piece I think actually decides his future. It is not the women. It is not Kendrick Lamar. It is what happens inside his own building the moment the people who write his checks look at the retention data instead of the debut numbers and realize the audience they thought they were buying is not the audience that is actually there. That thread deserves its own night, and the video sitting right next to this one is where I lay the whole thing out, so go run that one immediately. Because from where I am sitting, the sales chapter of this story is over, whether the paperwork has caught up to it yet or not. The kingdom is still standing. The lights are still on. It is just that the people who built the place have already walked out the front door, and nobody left inside is honest enough to tell him the room is empty.